Okay, guys, let's start with whoever is here. If anyone comes later, they can join us. Thanks again for coming to the last IDDV 360 talk for the fall. We are starting again in late January, hopefully with more talks in person for next semester. And today we have Dr. Lisa Peña from Arizona State University. She's gonna talk a little bit about the history of information design and data visualization, touching on some names that probably are less known than the ones that we probably are more familiar with. So I'm going to let you, Lisa, to introduce yourself and share whatever you would like with the students. In the meantime, I will share the slides on my end. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me and for coming. I appreciate you participating. As she said, I'm in Arizona, so for me, it's very early still, start of my work day. But I want to use today to share a little bit about my research. I focus on 18th and 19th century historic information design. I myself am a graphic designer at Arizona State. I'm a clinical professor, and I'm also the program head of graphic design. A lot of our program does touch on history, but not as much as I'd like, which is what kind of inspired me to go down this path. And I was told that a number of you have information design history course, and so some of this may look familiar to you, but my research really starts to focus on the methods, the themes, and the contributors, the stories behind the individuals, and what methods were created that kind of inspired or influenced methods that followed. So that's what I'll be doing today, is sharing that information with you. Sheila, if you can go ahead and click, please. So with our students, we have to take 2 semesters of graphic design history, and this is the Meg's book they use. And Sheila and I were joking about how this book has been around for many years and gone through many editions. So I'm sure it's something you might be familiar with. What got me started on my research journey was in teaching. I had a lot of students who I realized did not have a lot of history and information design, and I wondered why. It had been a while since I opened the book. I looked at it and I discovered that the text had approximately 5 pages dedicated to information design and data visualization, which wasn't very much, because of those about 5 pages, there were 2 pages of text and the rest was just imagery. And of the images, they had Descartes, they had William Playfair, and that was pretty much it. It summed it all up kind of neatly and moved on. And so I thought that was really unfortunate, because there's so much content to share and to help explain how the field developed into what it is today, and how we certainly use a lot of the methods that were implemented in the past, in present day, and for modern problems. So this led me to wanting to address some basic questions with my students. Sheila, if you can please click. Thank you. A lot of the questions I was receiving was, when did it begin? What is it known for? Why should we care about historic information design? And essentially, what is it? How would we define it? So when I started my research, I found that, oh, not yet. Go ahead and click once. There you go. When it began, this is something that I found is kind of hotly contested depending on what your background is with information design. A lot of the texts I've encountered said 18th and 19th centuries when it flourished, because that's when it went from European to really American focused creation and somewhat dominance. Not that it wasn't still occurring around the world, it absolutely was. Others say it's 16th century, and then some argue that nope, it's been around since even the Egyptians, when they were surveying the stars and the areas they lived. So it's still an area that I think as a field we're still defining the limitations of it. If there are even limitations, I'd say it's broader than what is often portrayed. And additionally, I feel that it's something that as we uncover more, we'll start to see how it crosses over different fields of discipline or practitioners. So that's something to pay attention to. It's known for, of course, taking visual translations of complex information, and it does that in a number of ways. And so we're going to look at that today and how everything from diagrams to charts to timelines, it just creates a lot of content for us to work with and to use design thinking to solve the issues that we're tackling. It's important, I feel, because there's a deep lineage to grab insight from. The problems that I found that were occurring in centuries before us are still problems we're encountering now. Especially, you're going to see some examples today when we talk about like the spread of cholera or yellow fever. I mean, we recently had COVID, and many of the methods in terms of creating these kind of thematic maps or identifying and plotting where sickness spread is still something that we do today. And so they still relate. There's a lot of connection between them. And so that's something I want my students to understand, that just because it's old doesn't mean it doesn't still have relevance in today. And then what is it? This is another interesting way to define it, because depending again on the profession, you might get some different definitions. Go ahead, Sheila, please click. In my research, I came across another researcher, Maria Jose Herrera, and she had the same kind of question I had, is how do we define it? So she had taken definitions from a number of fields who practice information design, data visualization, and she collected them and found where do they overlap? What are the similarities? And so I loved her definition. I felt it was really encompassing of what I was doing for my research, and so I went ahead and used that. So that is the definition you see on the left. Information design certainly transforms, as I said earlier, big complex problems into effective and digestible information to support the user to understand what you want them to take away from it, or how to persuade them, or just to educate them. These are just a sample of books that I came across in my research, and each one had something beautiful and different to offer. What I found also, though, was when I wanted to get a deep understanding of our history, it was somewhat limited. Most of the books shown, go ahead and click, Sheila, please. About half of them really went beyond like the initial 5 pages, like I was talking about with Meg's, and provided a deeper history. And some of them, it's not text, it's more of the visuals, a visual kind of collection of what occurred. And so this is what I would like to see and encourage us as designers to improve upon, to find out what it is we can do, because most of them still focused on 19th, 20th century information design, not so much pre-19th century. The other challenge with the textbooks we have today is that they tend to repeat the same contributors, the same names, same works. And this is a challenge, because then it means that we limit where we look to find more information about our field. Go ahead, Sheila. So what I've gathered here is a group of famous information designers. Of course, they did not call themselves that. You're looking at individuals who did not fall under the categories of information designer, data researcher, information architect. Instead, what you're looking at are astronomers, educators, scientists, cartographers, doctors, statisticians. These individuals came together to start to take information away from the written word and into the visual space that we know it today. These are more of the well-known, the ones I found repeated in many textbooks that I looked at. They certainly should be celebrated for the works that they produced, but I feel that there's certainly more that we can bring into the fold and celebrate in addition to these individuals. Go ahead, Sheila. So if you look at the early 18th century information design kind of works that we see, we know that the textbooks often say, well, they're predominantly European. So when I say that, England getting the shining star of it, we also often hear about France, Italy. We really don't hear about America. We don't hear about Asia. We don't hear about Africa. And it's really very centric to that. It doesn't mean it wasn't happening anywhere else. In fact, my research challenges that. But this is what is highlighted as the origins. We also know it's predominantly male. A lot of times this makes sense because of the fact that societal norms at the time had women not being able to participate in a lot of the same, careers as men were at the time. A lot of the work is highly qualitative, maps, timelines, diagrams. You can see here that there's not so much a lot of data necessarily being translated. I say it's data, that it's all data, no matter if it's qualitative or quantitative, but I'm saying data quantitative in terms of numbers. We don't see charts being developed necessarily or full-on graphs. We also have, as I said, a number of contributors, so different professions. There were specific themes. A lot of it is geography-based, history-based, religion, and we have a number of methods that are employed. So we have a lot of these are engraved or hand printed or written. If you see color, it's often painted or added. We do have a few pieces that are interactive. Not seen here. I did find some that were puzzle pieces. In the top second from the left, we have Weiger's 1720s. His is a timeline, and it actually has a hand on it, and the hand rotates around, so it's an interactive piece for users. Go ahead, Sheila. But I want to highlight a few. So this is Noli's. This is a map of Rome. It's a massive piece. It looks small here, but it is huge. It covers an entire wall. It's multiple sheets. So if you can think of parent sheets overlaid to place it up on the wall, and it's extremely detailed. It was commissioned by Pope Benedict XIV. I want to highlight this just because if you can see this online, like if you can search for this, it is beautiful, the detail, and it talks about the land masses and where gardens are. It highlights all the points of the city. And it's something that is certainly inspiring to look at in terms of understanding the layers of the location, the places, streets, and how the city is clustered together. Go ahead and click, please. Go ahead and click the next. This is Humboldt. Alexander Humboldt was certainly more qualitative in his work. He was showing the flora and how it changed as he ascended the mountainside. There's a lot of written text there, but you also do get to see the difference in cloud ranges. You get to see the different in vegetation. But this is very pushing forth the scientific side of information that we see. Go ahead again, Sheila. By the 19th century, though, we start to see a little bit of a shift, still qualitative, but now quantitative is coming in. We're also seeing the maps that we saw before used more than just geographic location. They're actually being used to share patterns or stories. So if you click, Sheila, for me. So here we see Dr. Snow's work. He was trying to understand the spread of cholera. And so he mapped out, you see it's kind of dark areas. He maps out the areas where cholera was spread and through the water. And what's interesting about him is the medical mapping that came from this continued on even beyond what he did. But as you're going to see in just a few slides, there's some people who predated what he did. But it's a good example, and it's one that's often shown in textbooks. Go ahead, Sheila. Here we have Emma Willard and her Temples of Time. She was one of the few women who received recognition for her work in the education field. She wants to represent time instead of the traditional kind of scroll or print, like laid out document. She experimented with 3D space and what if we show time in depth. And so you can see how she laid out chronological beginnings of time to present or to current. She played with color. She wasn't afraid to experiment beyond what we are used to seeing prior to this. And then go ahead and click, Sheila. And if any of you have read Edward Tufte's book, you're familiar with this one. This is Charles Joseph Menard, whose work with Napoleon's March into Russia is one of his favorites. It's great because of all the layers that this work has to share, where we see data regarding like population or a grouping of his army over a map with below at the very bottom is weather, letting us know temperatures they were dealing with. So it's something that's really important and interesting for us to see how deep communication can be even on this 2D surface. Go ahead, Sheila. But here we have William Playfair. He's the one who is given a lot of credit for, in terms of when we start talking about quantitative with data. He's the one who talks about bar charts, who created pie charts, line charts. And so he's given a lot of influence in the field. And so as I mentioned earlier in Meg's book, he's one of the few who's really focused on it and talked about. The challenges, and when I was doing my research, is he's not necessarily the first. There's hints of others who might have done it. And one of them in particular is said to potentially have introduced him to line charts. And based on the research of Svensson Weiner, they said that he was actually probably most likely influenced by, go ahead and click, Sheila, his brother, John Playfair. Is also a mathematician and statistician, and he suppose it was alleged he created the line chart, and that his brother's the one who actually produced it, which is why he gets credit for them. So it's because of that and finding that research that made me think, well, who else do we want to know about? So I've shared with you a lot of the kind of well-known works, the well-known people, but let's start changing and going into some of the lesser known, or also highlighting how the works connect. Sheila, can you hit click, please? So we're going to look at a sample. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go over as many as I'd love to with you, but a sample of some lesser known. If they're not lesser known, I at least want you to highlight their significance. And also by the end, I'll be contrasting some of the connections and what we see with their work. Go ahead, Sheila. So here we have William Price. You might be familiar with him. His map that you see here predates Nolli's, the one I showed you that was commissioned by Pope Benedict XIV. So this predates that, but what I thought was interesting is we see a lot of the same themes of highlighting a city and trying to understand from a street level perspective what is it they had to share. And so with this, we see an example of how visualization can inform future inhabitants of the area. This map actually underwent a lot of revisions over time. It was originally owned by William Price's partner, and when he passed away, William Price took over and would add and kind of reprint or reproduce the map with additions to it each time. There's a lot of little tiny details in this, so Sheila, if you can click, I have a slightly zoomed in view here, where you can see the street view. Certainly it's not in perspective when you see the homes, and you can tell that it's a little skewed. But what I like about this piece, or what I find interesting, is when you see the homes, they remind me of icons in the sense of he's applying, we're not seeing the true form of the house and what it looks like. He's not going that detailed, just showing where the inhabitants are. And so they're treated like these what I would say is symbols in a sense of where things are laid out in the town. We also see where a cemetery is, we see where the workhouse is. And so while it may not be completely just compared to the map that we later see in Rome, this one it's interesting for me because it starts to show what's possible in terms of communicating a space of where things are, what you're getting into. It tells a story about a potential desired place to live. There's also in the map itself, when we saw the big version of it, in the bottom left, there was a lot of written text. And if you look at that, it highlights where there were fires in the city. And unfortunately, there were quite a few. And it also highlights when smallpox was spread, what years it came through. And even that's interesting because for me, that is kind of the stepping stone that leads to the medical mapping that we'll see a little bit later. Go ahead, Sheila. And here we have Carolyn Herschel. Now, Carolyn, she is an astronomer, and she was recognized as one. Despite it being 18th century, she was one of the few women who received pay because she was an assistant with her brother. And so she was documented as one of the female astronomers as a profession. But when you look at her work, what I want you to see here is we often think about hearing about the stars, planets, the sun. When we hear that, we think Galileo, and what comes to mind might be his diagram of sunspots. But what I want to show you is with her work, she actually presented a research document to the Royal Society and was sharing a comet she found that she discovered, and it became known as Lady's Comet. And her work was very interesting in that her observations were ones that you often didn't see women creating at the time. And she assisted her brother, but to make sure that her work wasn't discredited, she often would do her research when he was away. So that way, when she presented, they couldn't say that her brother was the one who provided her with the information. And he was famous in his own right. He was the one who discovered the planet Uranus. And so the two of them often collaborated, but she went rogue, which I love. And she independently started doing research that helped her to highlight what she knew, what women were capable of. And it was just a really unique contribution to the field. And I wish she got a little bit more attention than what she does. Go ahead, Sheila, next. So as I said earlier, a lot of the early works are stated to be European, and Dr. Snow is also given a lot of credit for his medical mapping. But here you see Dr. Valentin Seaman and a sample of his work. What he was doing was very similar to what Snow did, but he predated Snow by over 50 years. What you're seeing here are the lower docks of Manhattan Island in New York. And what he was trying to figure out was the spread of yellow fever. How was it spreading? Where was it occurring? So he used maps and started to functionalize them by adding in where he found cases occurring. So if you look kind of to the bottom left side of the dock, you can see clusters, and he was highlighting individual cases as well as groupings. He also highlighted fatalities. He did note seeing mosquitoes, which we know are the culprits of the spread of yellow fever. Unfortunately, he didn't identify that truly as a problem. He thought it was more of the environment at the harbor, because there was a lot of pollution, a lot of waste that was just thrown at the ports. So he inaccurately identified the cause, but I still feel that his method certainly was something that developed later, but we don't hear about him as often. Instead, we hear of Snow and a few others that actually came after him. His approach really demonstrates how theories and patterns can be detected if we apply them to other methods such as the mapping you see. Go ahead, Sheila. Here we have Robert Wilkinson. He is an English cartographer. He created a number of atlases for basically a book of atlases, and experimented with different design methods. He also, in addition to this piece, has created a timeline, a tree of timeline. And so he clearly was very interested in experimenting. How do we visualize information for viewers? This is his Emporium Antiquorum, which essentially means ancient empires. And what's interesting is you see how he's colorizing masses, identifying rulers, and trying to show the time period of who ruled and when. But what's unique about this is instead of just showing the map, he adds a table, a chronicle table. Go ahead and click, Sheila, please. And he uses this to highlight when each ruler occupied which area, so that you can connect the two. So you activate the map and this table to get a richer story. And this is something that in my research I found you didn't see as often. And so I wanted to highlight this for you so you can see how the two engage, as well as the table alone, how much information that has, and the layers and depth of storytelling. Go ahead, Sheila. Thank you. Alice Hudson is a map librarian, and I mentioned her because she started looking at female cartographers. And being a graphic designer, I don't necessarily look into cartography, but I came across her work, And I felt it was really interesting and necessary to share that she found Shanadithet. And Shanadithet is part of Newfoundland's Beothuk tribe, and she was one of the surviving members of her tribe. In fact, pretty much the only member. And what we're seeing here is a map of her depiction of her from her memories of what occurred with her tribe. And so she, even though it looks, compared to the maps we've already seen, it looks a bit more organic in nature, it actually has been deemed as one of the most accurate depictions of what occurred. There's other men who are professional cartographers who tried to mimic and convey the same information, and they weren't as successful as her. Unfortunately, her story is actually a bit sad and heartbreaking, because after her tribe was attacked, she was taken and put into servitude, and she worked for a family, and it was through that time with them that she learned to read and write in English. She also met William McCormick, who was an explorer at the time, and he's the one who took an interest in her and started to show her cartography. She, I believe, created around 5 pieces, and if memory serves, I believe there's only one really that is prominent in existence. But her visualization was one of the most precise that they've seen to date. Go ahead, Sheila. Some of you might recognize her. This is Almira Phelps, and if you don't, that's okay. What's nice and interesting with her is earlier we looked at Emma Willard. Emma Willard is actually Almira's sister, and the two of them were actually very involved in creating visual works for the education, or the field of education. They were motivated and inspired by Humboldt, who we saw earlier. You can see that this is from a textbook in botany that she had produced. It's just a sample diagram. There's many more, and she and her sister both believed process over ornamentation, which is something I think is really important when we're talking about information design from the sense of how do we inform others. And so she used that as her primary tactic, but she and her sister continued to experiment. There's a number of examples where she would reproduce works, like she reproduced the work of Alexander von Humboldt for her own book and translate it to English, because she wanted to learn more about how to translate information. She was fascinated by that. Her works were so popular that she went through 28 editions in over 44 years, and she sold approximately 350,000 textbooks. So her work was, even though she wasn't allowed necessarily to work in the field and do some of the same things as her male counterparts, she did so in the field of education. And a lot of her books, interestingly enough, were sent not only to schools for girls, but schools for boys as well. Go ahead, Sheila. Thank you. Henry Drury Harness, he was hired by the Irish Railways Commission. He was hired to show the traffic and population density in Ireland, and as well as the movement of goods. And so he used this by playing with flow lines, having thick and thin lines, also playing with the contrast of them from darkness to lightness to highlight where things were dense in terms of the movement from the major cities to the smaller towns. Some of you, if you look closely, this is very similar to the method that we saw from Charles Joseph Minard and his maps, which he loved that method of flow maps. But it is said that Harness's version was the first published flow map. He was very interested in visualizations and went on and also tested out thematic maps to show density using contrast. But again, we see a method that is predominantly highlighted as coming from Minard, and instead of this individual who predated him. Go ahead, Sheila. And so here's a close-up just to allow you to see the lines themselves. centering out from the city. And you can see how very similar they were earlier to when I shared the Napoleon's March into Russia. Go ahead, Sheila. Thank you. Here we have William Farr. William was a statistician and English epidemiologist. I hope I said that right. He produced, and this is a long title, so I'm going to actually kind of lean in and read it here. So, Temperature and Morality of London for Every Week of 11 Years. What's interesting is very much like you've heard before, he wanted to see the spread of cholera, but noticed he did not use a map. So what we're trying to do here, what he was showing was he collected 12 circle graphs and divided them up so they represent each year, month, and dates. He documented the temperatures and the number of deaths that occurred. What's interesting about this is he really believed that cholera was spread by what was deemed bad air. So again, kind of pollutants coming out from the different areas of cities. He actually disagreed with Dr. Snow, but then ultimately came around and realized he was wrong, and he ended up aligning with Snow in the end. But what I appreciate about this piece is it uses color to reveal patterns. You can start to, if you think of Tufte, when he talks about his small multiples, you can start to see how this snapshot begins to show when cholera was predominant and when it wasn't. Farr also continued his, not yet, one more. Farr also expanded on the possibilities that doctors had for conveying work. Like I said, he didn't use a map. But what's interesting is ultimately he ended up collaborating with Florence Nightingale and her work. Okay, go ahead, Sheila. Thank you. And the last one I have for you is Francis Walker. He was a statistician, and he also created these works for the Atlas of the United States. He gathered the data from the 9th census in 1870 and published it in 1874. This work, it's a bar chart, which we've seen before from Playfair, but what I liked about it is it combines years, debt, revenue, and expenditures by department. And so we see how where the bar chart was used in the past is now being introduced in a way where we see a lot more data density being presented. We can also clearly see the different columns that represent the color-coded debt, public debt from the time span that he is focusing on. Go ahead, Sheila. So I've given you kind of this brief overview of a sample of some of the overlooked. I want you to leave here thinking that, or reminding you of the methods and visualizations increased from the 18th to 19th centuries. And certainly we have a lot of contributors that built off of what others did. Some were happening simultaneously. Some were a lot more connected in that they actually collaborated together. But what they depicted and why they were effective is what is really the story I want you to leave with, and understanding that there's this broader picture of how these methods continue to work and continue to help us with our world today. Numerous themes, numerous individuals who participated, and so hopefully over the next few years, more and more of these individuals will come to the surface for us to see. I also had a very quick graphic. Go ahead and show the timeline. Thank you. I also, just to kind of visualize what we were talking about, so Joseph Priestley, William Playfair, Alexander von Humboldt, and William Farr, just using them as examples. I plotted some of the work that I found from there in the research there, the gray dot, and the pink dot is essentially the individuals who they influenced. And when I say influenced, they verbally said, yes, I looked at this individual's work. And I denoted of when their work started to come out. And as you can see, there's this pattern of when they start to continue, the kind of where the last person left off and develop the work. Alexander von Humboldt actually had 5 individuals I found, and there's much more I know, but a few that were inspired by him. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Farr and Nightingale, who ultimately partnered up because of their interest in the field as well as how it applied to science. So with all this, what I want to really wrap up with is saying that charts, diagrams, timelines, no matter what you're interested in, they have all endured time for a reason. We see proof of them evolving from 2D representations into the digital realm that we have today. And technology may have adapted what designers can do with data, but the primal purpose remains that viewers are accustomed to this and have become accustomed to it over time, and they see the benefits and capabilities it has to offer. Go ahead, Sheila. And that's it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions from you guys? Had a question or a yes?
That was a very lovely talk. I like the timeline at the end. I was curious, how did you make those connections? Like, did you read through a lot of stuff? Like, what was the process like for you assembling that history?
That's a great question. Thank you. It started out with a literature review. I went in and I started looking at the well-known and seeing who mentioned who, if there was any documentation of those stating they were influenced by one another. And so certainly I denoted when those comments were made. And so that's how I came up with the beginnings of that timeline. The other thing I started to do is just evaluate the work that I've came across itself. You started to see patterns with, for example, with the thematic maps. If you go and look at those, you can start to see when they popped up, and the method didn't quite change very much over time. And the more I dug into it, the more I started to then realize that, oh, this person lived in the same country as this person, or this person was in the same kind of, sometimes they were like educational gatherings and things that they would participate in. And so that's how I started building those connections. So figuring out, one, what I came across in my literature review, two, what I saw from the different visualizations I collected. And then the third way is sometimes it was just happenstance. I would find something and I was curious if there was any link. And as I dug for that link, either came up short or I'd find one piece that connected the two people. It's like they knew the same person. And that was an opportunity for them to either have met or to have shared. I can't prove that they talked or they actually got to know one another, but I could say it's highly likely that they crossed paths. In fact, one of the individuals I didn't talk about today is Benjamin Franklin, but I can tell you he traveled to Europe quite a bit. And there is the lunar, I don't know, do y'all know about the Lunar Society? Have you heard about that? So the Lunar Society is a group of individuals who would meet, and it's pretty much European, English type individuals who think of it like a secret club. And they would come together to talk about their research and their findings. And it was rumored that Franklin was invited. It was so secretive, but they said that it was rumored that he was invited. So when he went on one of his trips and came back, I started looking at his work and went, he's doing more diagramming. He's doing more of the chart styles we see in Europe. So can I prove he was there? No. Can I prove that he spoke to those individuals? No. But there's certain pieces that come out from those potential gatherings that to me indicate that he absolutely was influenced by the individuals he came across, and then he brought that with him. So of course now he's influencing individuals in America, and vice versa, who's to say that he didn't take some of the methods we had here and showed them there. But it was a big puzzle piece, but that is how I started to develop the connections, was through those methods.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm curious about something, Lisa, because you mentioned, of course, I think most of us are familiar with Minard's work, but not with some people that have preceded him, but some of them not for that many years. Do you have a hypothesis, or do you have a sense of why the work of some individuals became much more well-known or famous than others?
Yeah, I'm working on that hypothesis still. I tend to think there's two things. One, I think that it has to do with if you were in favor of, like, for Menard, he was celebrated. He's one of the few who was actually, during his time, celebrated for the work he did. Unlike Playfair. Playfair was actually the opposite. He was like, dang it, I'm important. You should like my work. And others were kind of like, it's there. It's not till years later did people start celebrating him. So Menard, I think, had the support. The French really appreciated what he was doing. So I think his work was, he had the means, let's put it that way, the means to share his work, to travel, to produce it. Whereas I think some of these older ones, these ones that predate him, they just didn't have that means. They were working for the country, but it wasn't something that was necessarily being spread beyond, maybe at the commission's office. And maybe that's where it stopped. And so not until now, when we can dig back into the works and start to investigate that, we say, oh, that's why that was well known. And same thing with, I think, with Dr. Seaman and Dr. Snow, 50 plus years, that's a lot of time, even though it's relatively the same method. And I think the same thing is, I don't think a lot of people knew who Dr. Snow was. I'm sorry, who Dr. Seaman was. He was just another person trying to solve a problem about the spread of a disease, whereas Dr. Snow, by then, you saw there's a number of people actually who predated him. They were all trying to figure out it, and he got the answer. And so that's where we see that happening. And I think that's where we have these well-known ones that continue to be highlighted instead of the lesser known. But I think it's important to find the balance between the two.
We have a follow-up. I don't know, Ernesto, if you want to unmute and share.
Sure, it's easier, I think. Oh, wait, no, that's not, this is it. Sorry, I have the thank you so much, Lisa, for this. This was fantastic. I have to confess that I was completely unaware about many of these things. So I really thank you for that. I do have, following up on what you're mentioning, I'm thinking about, Florence Nightingale, like experienced that same thing, right? She was recognized and celebrated in life, but that's because she had, her influence extended well beyond her activities as a designer, right? So she had, some degree of political power. So like, is that somehow an explanation? One was actually helping the other in a way?
Yeah, that's certainly possible. I think I don't want to discredit her, because I think
no, I'm not.
Yeah, her contribution was important too. But yeah, she's actually, in my research, is actually a individual who a lot of people argue over, because her rose chart is one that they have later found is not necessarily accurate. And so individuals sometimes dismiss her and saying, well, perhaps it's these collaborations she was doing, perhaps it's the influence she had. She potentially didn't have the full understanding, but did enough to, as you say, kind of convey what the gist of the problem was and how to solve it moving forward. But absolutely, she could fall into that category of being successful because she had made a name for herself, but also collaborating with the right individuals to help push her work to the forefront. That's absolutely possible there. Especially, I'm still digging up information on her. There's tons on her, but it tends to be, some of it's the same thing, or some of it's more about not the visual work she did. And so I'm getting a little bit of a roadblock, but I really want to investigate more of these collaborations. That's kind of my next list of to-dos, because I'd love to uncover more of the interconnectivity of all the individuals together. I think there's a bigger story to tell there. But you're right that it's quite possible that her celebrity, for lack of a better term, is what got her work out there and recognized more so than the others who came before her.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask if you encountered challenges when doing these visual analyses. Like how did you define what qualified as information design and not just map making or cartography? And if you that is like one difficulty that I can identify, but I wonder if you identify other like other boundaries that you had to delimit in order to be able to include or not some of these people in your study.
That's a great question. Yes, it's very challenging because I feel when you're dealing with visual work, it's very subjective. So I had to set my limitations early. For example, even with terms, I had to say, I'm going to say data, but I also mean that in the terms of layers and defining what I meant by qualitative and quantitative. And so breaking that information down early was important for my research. The other thing is I had to ask myself, is this just a map, or is it a map that's trying to do more than just show direction or show location? What was the purpose of it? And that's really what helped me with my research, was identifying, is there a deeper purpose or functionality to this that can help tell the story of what I'm trying to convey? And so what I did is I created a spreadsheet for myself. I have like 4 spreadsheets. They're pretty massive. And they're these directories that help me to search my work and see if I felt it was something of value that helped to push the narrative forward, or was it something that was just, here's just another, it's fascinating, but it's just another map, right? Like there's nothing new to it, nothing exciting, or I shouldn't say exciting, they're all exciting, but nothing that pushed the field forward further. So I had to create that. Then I created another document, and I actually, so on my committee, my research committee, I had an archaeologist, and I worked with her, and I asked her the same question of you, how do I document this? Because I need to justify it. I'm going to have people say, well, why'd you include this and not that? In archaeology, they have what's called contact sheets, and they have to use that to document every artifact that is found. It goes through a description, it goes through a name, when it was found, the date it was found, the resource, like everything. And I took that as a framework, and I created my own, and I altered it, and so it was all about information design. So I had, who was the creator, what time period did they create it, what medium did they use, what are the layers of the visualization that I'm looking at, what is the purpose of it, and then I had a little area that was what theme, and I found multiple themes, so it was just like a little binary setup of like, yes, it had this theme, or no, it didn't. And then at the very end, I had where I could include any information that was written about it, that it pre-existed. And then below that, I had my version of what was my interpretation. What did I take away from it? And so I had over 130 contact sheets that I created of all the work that I found. And it allowed me to organize them. It allowed me to, I also would put a sample, I'd screenshot a sample of the work and put it there. So I had all the written context and the visual context all together so I could reorder them. And it helped me to figure out not only the connections that we talked about earlier, but also to be able to defend why I'm including certain works and why I was excluding others. So it was really kind of having to create my own methodology, but I did borrow from archaeology. I can't take full credit of that. In the future, as I continue to work on this, I actually would like to work with a developer who can help me to categorize it in a much more efficient way, because I was doing it with printouts and using a PDF to flip through and use the find key to go and type information. And I think there's a much easier way to do that. It was just, for me, I'm very a tactile person, very visual. I like to have things in front of me. I like to pin things up and step back. So I did it in the printed version, but ideally I'd like to have kind of basically a database for myself that I can build on. And we do, in the field, we do have something similar to that already. There's some, Michael Friendly is one who's already created a database like that. His is a little bit different than mine, but I know that there's other practitioners out there and educators who are looking to do that. But I would like to do one for my method. So stay tuned, give me some time, maybe I'll get that up and running.
Thank you.
I love, Lisa, that you shared that with us, because some of the students are working with their thesis. So we are looking at literature review, how to start creating frameworks, how to analyze, how to collect, how to identify themes. So it was a very timely recommendation and insight. So thank you for that, Lisa.
Thank you.
Should visualize this data sets.
Yes.
Visualization of it.
One of the students should do that, should take over the project and create a visualization. The task for you.
I have hi, Paolo, nice to meet you. Thank you for the presentation. First of all, I'm in love with the history of information design. So thank you for your talk. And I was thinking about this, what makes some of these people standing. And it's also interesting in the case of snow that actually, I read an article, the very same moment in the same place in London, there were other two maps identical, like, one few months after, if the date is correct. But the reason why only the one of snow was recognized, and that's what the article says, is because of what happened, because it was able to interpret that in a certain way and to, go make the case, oh, that's right, because the others, they were not. But they designed an identical information design artifact, but they didn't come to any conclusion, or not the one that Snow got. So I think it's often, as in the case of Florence Nightingale, is what happens, what the visualization enables, or what is the impact more than the visualization itself. And I think that's good for us. It's not just the visual. It's the context, it's the moment, it's more than that. It's more than the pure visual aspect. And so, sorry, that's not a question. It's more a moment.
So you think, sorry, and I'm follow up to this one. So you think that the creator does not impact how people see the visualization?
Oh, it is, of course, but not entirely. There are some conditions, and the people he was able to expose this visualization to, or of course, he had an hypothesis that the others didn't have, and so that's why he had a different path. He designed that and went to show that map to some people. That he got into a conversation and discussion, and then he went back and did something. There is a whole story around it that makes that piece that is identical to others more relevant. So I think that's interesting, a way to show the limits of visualization. So it's not all about the visualization. It's enabled. It enables something that happens, and the way that happens makes some of those identical pieces more relevant than others. So just again, it's not a question. So. But it was interesting, it struck me that memory about this article.
No, that's great. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, and I have another comment. Because when I saw those temperature radial diagrams, it made me think about how quick was the spreading of some of those visualizations into like a more public usage. Because I have a memory of a page of the statistical annuals of the Paris, the statistical offices of French statistical office, that used amazing visual reports with the statistical data using some of those charts, but maybe that few years later they've been invented. In a public context, if we think today, what is the level of visualization of data within the government, and how far it is from research, let's say, that those years, and we are talking about the 19th century, the 5 years later, the statistical office, the public offices in Paris that were able to make use in very nice ways of those charts.
Mhm.
And that's, they were better than we are.
I agree.
Yes, if you
Yeah.
ever want. Oh, go ahead.
We have a question, yeah.
Oh, okay. I think I have a question, maybe based off of that. It's something you said earlier. I'm really interested in like what other insights you've gleaned through your research that weren't like direct questions you had, but something you started noticing, kind of like tangent to your purposeful research. So I'm kind of interested in, as you're conducting this research throughout the 18th and 19th century, of how you've noticed where the designer was from. How did that impact, the design, how much work they were generating, how well received it was, and I'm just interested in what you noticed about that.
That's a great question. In terms of how it was received, that's been a little harder than I anticipated. I thought I'd find a lot of literature of people who supported it. They were saying a lot of these are like life-saving type visualizations, or if not life-saving, certainly informative. Like I talked about with the maps of where to live, what's occurred in those towns, things like that. And it's not so simple, because a lot of the ones, especially the European ones, were done for royalty or for government. So they only went so far. It's not like they were all mass produced necessarily. For the US, it's even lesser known. It's more of, I want to say by the turn of the century, it really started to pick up. As I said, that's when the Americans were like, hey, we can do this, and we start seeing it implemented more. But the recognition of the work was, I would say, still slow going, unless it was like in a textbook. It had to be for some purpose, like some higher level, for it to really spread and get dispersed to like the public consumption level. I forgot the other half of your question. Please reiterate.
I guess just any other insights that you've gleaned, but I think specifically I'm thinking about the different countries people are from. Yes. I think just to context this, I think like I've had a lot of conversations since joining this program about why is it so difficult in America to get people to understand what it is we do, whereas in other countries in Europe, it's just like it's a known thing, it's a respected thing. And so I'm wondering if we can look at that historically, maybe like who was commissioning those things. You were saying like royalty, whereas in America, it's like the presidencies, and maybe at the governmental level, it hasn't been implemented and respected. So then it's not filtering down, to the common people. But I'm just really interested in that.
Fascinated by what you just said. Okay, thank you for the context. That helps. Yes. So essentially, I think it's more celebrated because in Europe, particularly in France, I know was like the hot spot where they loved it. Okay, I mean, they loved it so much. Playfair went there just to get the accolades that he didn't get from his country. Okay, so I think they've had it accepted longer than we have in the U.S. And so I think that is a really from your research, that's a really strong point to focus on. Is yes, it was something that was accepted sooner than it was here. I will say in the U.S., what's interesting is when we started to get into the census, that's when it began to grow. If you go and look at the Library of Congress, that's what I did. You can pull a lot of the old census material. It's like they had a field day. Like you get a new method, and they have like timelines and diagrams and charts, and they have so much in it. But it wasn't consumed by the public. It was getting done, and we had people doing it, but it just wasn't celebrated in the same way. And when it was, there's a map that I found that was after the Civil War, I believe, where they started selling the maps to raise money. And so it was one of the few pieces that was being purchased by the public, right? And of course, there was a cause linked to it, but it was one of the few examples I found where the Americans were celebrating and going, yes, let's get this map. Let's all have it hanging up in our home. in terms of the US, and I don't think this is going to be a surprise, religion. Religion was something that also, for the individuals I found who made religious, and they look like infographics to me when they did their religious depictions. They would purchase those, and they were usually like scrolls, or sometimes they were like, think of big print pieces that they would have in their homes, because it would talk about the creation of life and then take you through basically what is represented in the Bible, and those were deemed appropriate to have in the house. Now, also don't forget, in terms of society, they really weren't big on women being educated. So that's another thing that you wouldn't find it distributed. And if it was mostly to men. And so I think these are some social or societal restrictions that also played a role in why it wasn't being spread, at least in America, as much as we saw when it was in Europe. I personally also started doing some more research and looking at Paul Kahn's work, where he is looking at international. He has a lot that he is starting to pick up from, I think it was Asia? I think it was in Asia. And we have a few others I started to find and I want to look into Africa. When I did, by the way, disclaimer, when I did my research, it was during COVID. So there was no traveling, there was nothing. I was having to just call or research remotely to find a lot of this. And so I believe there's a lot more out there to find. It's just at the time I couldn't. And so it's a future goal to partner and see where these occur. But for you in particular, I would say I would look at which designers or information designers were accepted. I think that's a big thing, and who was commissioning their work, what type of work were they doing? Was it for public consumption, like we were talking about with the spread of illness or something, or was it more really just to talk about, to inform royalty of what they had in their country? I would then also look at I would think looking for America, if you want to see perhaps why it wasn't spread as much. I gave you reasons already, but I would probably dig into seeing if there's anything related to the cost of production, because or if there's limitations in production. I know that when the printing presses came around, that's when we started to see an expansion, but it still cost a lot of money to have things colorized, because those were usually hand painted until we started to get into color inks and things. So it also might be a manufacturing, for lack of a better term, reason of why they weren't spread as quickly. You also have to imagine, the US took a while before we developed compared to some of the other countries. So that those two could have another role in why it wasn't widely as accepted right away.
Thank you so much. It's so fascinating.
Oh, you're welcome. Yes.
Last question, comment, anything? Just one more.
Is it a graphic design program?
Ask us, Lisa. They are trying to better understand what the context in what you're teaching, which program are you in, what courses do you teach?
Yes, sure. So it's a graphic design program. And when I earned my PhD, it's through the design school here at ASU, and it was a PhD in design, environment, and the arts. And I had a historic focus on mine. For our courses we teach, so the first 2 years of our undergraduate program is fundamentals. Everything is hands-on, little bit of computer. And by the time they get to their 3rd year, which is what I teach, I get them for information design. So I have a lot of fun. I don't know that they do initially, but they get there. It's very different. It's funny. Their first 2 years is like, get us away from these fundamentals. Stop giving me rules. They come to my year. I said, the rules are gone. Be creative. And they're like, where are my rules? So it's really interesting. But their third year, they spend majority of it working on information design, and we do client work. We partner with different individuals or groups, nonprofits, to give them experience with that. And then their fourth year, they pick a social issue and they develop that for an entire year, ultimately culminating in an exhibition where they have to create a book, an exhibit, and a presentation that expresses everything that they've learned. And so a lot of their information design work is put into their book and their exhibit. For our grad program, we've paused our grad program right now. We're revamping it, but ultimately we look into information design is one of the areas that students can take courses in. We also are looking at doing more with service design, strategic design, sustainability, accessibility, and so we're looking at expanding into those areas deeper than what we do right now.
That's
but
amazing.
yes,
I
for
didn't know
graphic
you
design.
also had the grad program. That's amazing.
Yeah, our grad program is one of the few that is studio based. It's not theory kind of focused or based program, or we do research, but it's strongly studio based, and so now we're revamping that to be a little bit more flexible. So it's because all of our studios incorporate research of some kind, but we want to find a good balance between the two. So we're revisiting that.
That's good.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. This was really interesting, and I think a very not so much discussed approach to the practices. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, thank you. And if anyone has questions or anything, I put my email up on the presentation. You're more than welcome to email me, or if you want, if I don't know, I do it because my students are like, are you on Instagram? My Instagram's up there. So if you want that, ask Sheila, it's available. You're more than welcome to reach out to me that way as well. But thank you all for this opportunity to meet with you and speak with you. I don't get to do it often, so I love it. I also like your squares. We do square within square projects on the walls. So when I see that, I'm going to share that with my colleagues because our whole building has designs like that. So I feel at home already. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate this. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye, Lisa. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.